Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on planet Earth, which is wrapped in many layers of turbulence, geopolitical, climatic, the information storm that we're all living in because of what's happening on social media and actually on the media too, not just social media. Um, this is Andy Revkin. This is a Sustain What webcast on a new paper about the sustainability of democracy and really about the sustainability of autocracy, which is the inverse, not the opposite of democracy, but it's a trend on the planet right now toward more states being autocratic, ruled by a single individual or power uh, cabal. And in the United States, these issues are highly relevant because of what's happening with our government. It's early days of Trump 2.0. And I, deal with generally with other kinds of disaster risk reduction and climate change and the like. But if our institutions and our norms of democracy are not sustained, then you can't really talk about climate and resilience and biodiversity and pandemics and all the rest. So I'm really pleased to have three authors of this new paper um, from the VDEM Institute, which is, we'll talk more about the name of it. It's the Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And they found interesting patterns, and we're just going to talk through what those patterns are and what they mean for the world and how nations relate to each other and how we relate to each other within nations. It's great to have you all here. Marina Nord, Fabio Angiolillo, and Martin. Sorry, Stefan Lindberg. And there are two other authors of this paper, both affiliated with the Institute at one time or another. So maybe we'll just start in with introductions. I just want to get a sense of who you are and what particular skill set you bring to these kinds of questions. Marina, maybe we could start with you. What draws you to this issue? Why are you tracking democracy and its and autocracy, and what's your particular focus?
I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Video Institute, and I have my background actually in economics and computer science. So before coming here, I eventually got interested in the process of autocratization linked to economic processes. And what we see now in the United States is very much linked to what was happening with the economy. And Initially, my research was on how authoritarian regimes deal with financial crisis and how they survive during financial crisis and what helps them to survive and why they sometimes break down. And then I ended up in the Vidum Institute and got more interested in general processes of autocratization and democratization and how those two are linked. And this is a joint paper where we combined all our research skills. So I think it's you can see it as a product of what all of us brought from different perspectives into the research that we do.
Great. And Felix, what's your background? Oh, I'm sorry. I haven't had enough coffee this morning. Stefan, how did you get involved in this, and what's your angle?
Yeah, thank you. I'm a professor of political science and director of the VDM Institute, and one of the founders of Varieties of Democracy as a project back in 2008 9, when we pulled together this large international team to measure democracy in better ways than we've done before, and then eventually also founded the VDM Institute, that's been the headquarters for the Varieties of Democracy project since at least 2015.
Yeah.
I've studied democracy and democratization and now autocratization for my entire academic career, and was also as a youth activist involved in an international movement back in 88, 89 in ending the Cold War and breaking down the Iron Curtain between East and West. So this goes far back for me.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting timeline to think about in the context of what at that time I think a lot of us felt the world was moving in a particular direction toward democratization and toward openness and transparency and human rights. But we see that those patterns don't always hold up.
Yeah, that's something for the younger listeners and for the postdocs here. Those were the good days, right? The early and into the mid 1990s, when the whole world was moving forward on democracy and getting more freedom and rights, and we were happy, looking forward to the future, you and I, right? And
I know.
now it's not quite that way anymore.
No, it just shows nothing is guaranteed. These things take work, and the work that you're doing is part of that. Fabio, what's your perspective, and what dimensions of skills and the like do you bring to this?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, like Marina, we we grew up with this autocratization and shrinkage of democracy across the world. My focus is as well on authoritarian politics mostly. That is where I come from, and I work especially on authoritarian ruling parties and their relationship with society. And at the Vidam Institute that I joined 2 years and a half ago, also studying autocratization, democratization, and democratic resilience in general, together with Stefan Marina.
Oh, sorry, you were
Here.
muted.
There we go.
Uh,
5 years of zooming and the like, and still muting. So anyway, let's start with some initial, just quick definitions of autocracy, democracy. Authoritarian. I think it's hard for the average person to keep track. We are talking about a unitary. Basically, autocracy is one person running the show. Is that right? The key thing. Maybe.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's the sort of definition that you find in dictionaries. I think the language is always developing, right? That's what the linguistics will tell you. And I think that both in academic writings and in the media generally, autocracy has come to mean something broader, meaning sort of different versions of non-democratic rule. So not necessarily by one person strictly, but can be a group, even a party, or a theocracy where a religious elite is ruling, and so on.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. Um, and tell us about the workings of the institute. You do regular reports, sort of a vital signs look at different nations' trajectories, and if we could break that down a little bit in terms of what the factors are that are assessed, that would be helpful. Maybe Marina, do you want to weigh in a little bit, and then we get some more from.
Yeah, of course. So just for those people who don't know, VDOM collects the largest data set on democracy in the world. So we measure almost every single aspect that you can think of. And the way we collect, we get expert opinions for more than 600 different indicators that measure different aspects of democracy. And then we aggregate them into sub-indices and then eventually into indices that are shown now on the screen. So we have 5 different indices. This is varieties of democracies, how you can think about that. And data collection runs annually. So right now we have finished gathering the data. We are now aggregating them into index. And then in March, we produce democracy report, which shows major global trends in democracy and autocracy across the board. So it's not only about index as such, it's also about what was causing the changes, which indicators were declining or improving the most, which countries have deteriorated, which are in the process of regime transformation, as we call it. And the one that you were showing, yeah, these ones, and this is important, on our website, you can play with the data and see.
Right.
This is what Andy is doing right now. You can see what was happening with any country in the world during the last 124 years. And the thing that you were showing before that was also for the United States before that. For example, then you can see that United States was during the last presidency of Trump was declining on many democracy indices. And then you can see which indicators were driving this change.
I know it's really interesting. It's obviously fascinating. And the data. Well, could you talk through the categories? Maybe Fabio, you want to weigh in here too. We have deliberative, participatory, egalitarian, electoral, liberal. Just a quick sketch. I don't know who feels most comfortable in weighing in on those parameters.
I think Staffan is the best person to ask.
Okay.
So briefly, electoral democracy is sort of the core of any democracy at the national level or federal, as in the U.S. It covers elections, obviously, that they should be free and fair and not without cheating and all that kind of stuff. But it also captures that the environment for the elections is free and fair to make them meaningful. So that means that freedom of association for both parties and civil society needs to be sufficiently good, and that they are not oppressed, intimidated, and that sort of thing. And then finally, that there is freedom of the media, so that journalists can write freely and critically about the government without being censored or intimidated and so on. So the environment of the election also needs to be good enough for electoral democracy. Right. Then you can think of these other varieties of democracy as saying, okay, electoral democracy is good, but not enough. So the liberal tradition would then say that electoral democracy can lead to the tyranny of the majority, right? A majority start to infringe on our individual liberties or on minority rights and so on. So we need to constrain electoral democracy. And therefore, we need that checks and balances, separation of power, and a strong legislature and a independent judiciary that can act as checks on the executive. That used to work for most part of the American history, but is not working that well right now, perhaps. And then, in the same fashion, then other traditions think of, so deliberative democracy is, okay, the electoral democracy is good, but it must also be, the quality of the debate must also be good. So politicians, elites must base their arguments on facts and reason, and also show respect to each other. They show the opposition respect and show people respect and so on. If I may say so, I often illustrate to people, I say, sort of Trump is the antithesis of deliberative democracy.
Yep.
And you can see it well on the graph.
Yeah, for sure.
The deliberative component was declining the most for the United States during last Trump's presidency. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. So that's the deliberative.
And then you have the participatory democracy that say, okay, electoral democracy, but we also need as much direct participation of people as possible with referendum and also influence between elections and so on. And egalitarian democracy, they can think of as a little bit, or has a left-wing heritage at least, and saying that the electoral democracy is good, but even those political rights there and participation in civil society and in media and so on is structured by socioeconomic conditions. So you need access to, for example, core good quality education, so that people have more of an equal possibility of participating in politics. Even voting is structured by that. Access to healthcare, so that you don't die, because then you don't have political rights, and so on. So some socioeconomic protections to enable the exercise of political rights in electoral democracy.
And you and I were talking before we went on air about what's particularly distinct in the United States democratic structures
Yeah.
compared to others. Can you weigh in on that? It was really interesting.
Well, I think one thing that maybe both Americans and Europeans and others don't think about so much is that so much of what constitutes democracy in the US is a matter of norms and agreements between the elites. Um, so the American Constitution is I mean that little almost pamphlet. It's so short. It's so general in many respects, compared to most democratic countries that have constitutions that detail the the workings and rules and regulations. That's the what is in the president or in the executive power, and what's with the legislature and other authorities. That's specified in other places, and this has consequences right now, right? It's very easy to tear down democracy in the US if um, the elites want to do it. Um, there's a famous, now Fabio is here, Italian, famous political scientist Giovanni Sartori, who was at Columbia University for many, many years. He said once that the American democracy works not thanks to, but despite the American Constitution.
That's
That's
interesting.
almost swearing in church in the US, right? But and he said it works only as long as the Americans want it to work. So that's in these times, I think, a critical aspect of democracy in the US that one needs to sort of keep thinking about.
Yeah, and just these past couple of days, we've seen evidence of the an intent to challenge those norms, to
Yeah,
dig in, to really test the system as far as you can drive it, and to do it in a sort of a high speed way, so that the institutions can't even catch up. It's kind of
yeah,
extraordinary to watch.
yeah.
Has that pattern played out elsewhere, or again, is it just so distinct to the United States, that vagueness you were talking about, that you don't see that kind of check? I mean, let me just talk about Brazil briefly. Bolsonaro, who you do mention in your paper, did seem to be pushing hard, in his look at the Amazon, indigenous rights. He was really pushing the limits. But are there other instances like that?
Yeah, I think if I won't monopolize space here, but what we see happening in the US right now is in many ways, on the sort of overall, in the big picture scheme of things, sort of typical for the processes of autocratization that we have seen the last 25 years or so, starting with Venezuela and then Putin in Russia, and Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, Orban in Hungary. We can go down the line. It's in the literature. It's called executive aggrandizement, swelling the executive to take over what used to be spheres of power located in other parts of the democracy, in the legislature, in the judiciary, media sphere, civil society influence, take over and expand um, what the executive, in the U.S., the president and his state secretaries and aides and so on can do and control and exercise power over.
Right.
We see that very clearly now with the actions towards USAID, FBI, CIA, FEMA, the state authority for consumer advice. I mean, there's the OMB. and taking actions that should be and have been the prerogative of Congress, for example, and seemingly ignoring decisions by the judiciary. Yeah. And that's been a very consistent pattern in the many autocratization processes that we've seen since the end of the 1990s.
Well, there you go. So let's get back into the paper now, because actually, one more thing from your reports, and then we'll get to the paper. And maybe Marina and Fabio can describe, the data in the most recent VDEM Institute report from last year shows these clear trends, and the numbers are very discouraging. Share of world population living in autocratizing countries went from 7% in 2003 to 35% in 2023. Share of world population living in autocracies, 50% to 71%. And the other numbers as well, just in terms of total number of countries. Marina and then Fabio, maybe just weigh in a little bit on what you see as the most important implications for this kind of trend.
Well, what we see, and yeah, the numbers are right, but what we see is that during the last 15 years, the number of countries that are autocratizing, so the ones that are moving into the wrong direction, let's call it, towards becoming more autocratic, it has overshadowed the number of countries that are democratizing. And this has been going on slightly, I would say, after the global financial crisis. And this is very particular because you don't show this graph, but usually we show the graph that during the 90s, you had 70 countries at the same time that were democratizing. This was the period when Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History. And then slightly shortly after that, like 7 years ago after that, like by the end of the 90s, early 2000, what we see is that the number of countries that were autocratizing started to increase. And this year, in 2023, we had 42. The maximum was 47 at the same time for 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And those what is particular for the last 25, 30 years is that the majority of countries, that's the number of countries that are, it's kind of democracies that started to decrease in quality. This is also a new trend, something that we didn't see during the 20th century, that so many countries, democratic countries, experience executive aggrandizement.
Boy. And that's one thing to just have the numbers in front of us, but it's another to think about the cause. You did mention that the Great Recession, and we have social media emerging as a potent shift in communication tools. Fabio, I don't know if you and or the rest of you are looking at the not just the trends, but also trying to assess drivers. It's really hard to do, in climate change. Attributing some change in the dynamics is very hard. So I don't know whether it's even possible, but maybe you could talk about that a
little bit. Yeah, I think that in terms of the drivers of autocratization, we have like many of the crises that are happening around the world that, of course, are making the ground easier for anti-democratic parties and anti-democratic leaders to seize power through valid elections. That's something still to be stressed. Right. I think that if we look at the trends that go back to the United States case, Bolsonaro, we have this polarization that is on the rise, and of course this mobilization, and going back a little bit on what Staffan was saying, normalization of anti-democratic behaviors progressively happens before the new anti-democratic leader gets elected. So the rhetorical racism, nationalism, these attacks to opposition, minority that can be ethnic, can be religious, or otherwise. These are all making the ground easier for anti-democratic behavior, anti-democratic leaders to steer the field, the political field in their favor. So I think that these are some of the origins that made a play like the world a safer place for anti-democratic leaders. And we have also these connections. Before you were showing a picture of Trump, Meloni, Orban. These are all leaders that talk to each other. So this normalization of anti-democratic behavior at the societal level, then it reflects on closed doors, elites talking to each other in terms of strategies, in terms of practices.
Wow. And I guess one of the other issues is who is the elite? In the United States, that term is typically applied, there's some irony to this now, to Democrats, meaning progressives, liberals. They're the ones who are tarred with being elite. But here you're describing the elite being power brokers. In the United States, corporate interests and wealthy ideological interests are an elite, but they're not described that way by the average person.
I mean, if we go back to pictures taken during the inauguration, we have the three most powerful humans lining up for Trump, right? If that's not elite.
Oh no, I agree with you completely. But somehow the messaging ends up being that they're your people, the common person's ally. I guess that's part of the dynamic that ends up happening as well. So now let's get to the U-turn part, which is what drew me to the paper. The possibility of autocratization being its own enemy and resulting in reversals. And you do track this trend pattern since 1900 of more than half of autocracies. Here's the key finding to me: 52% of all autocratization episodes become U-turns, and you can have even in many cases restored or even improved levels of democracy. So let's talk through this for the next 10 minutes or so, and then there are some good questions coming in that we can address. Is this a hopeful sign, or is it, or not?
I would say,
yes.
If I may jump, I would say it's a very hopeful side. And as an anecdote, I would tell a story how it started. 2 years ago, when we were working on Democracy Report, Staffan was just drawing something in his notebook. And before that, we knew about 2 cases, South Korea and Ecuador, where this happened. And those were very, very unique. That's what we saw. And then Staffan started to identify manually several more cases where those happened. And in Democracy Report 2023, we looked at 8 of those cases. And then after it was, because that was very quick and dirty analysis, like what happened in those cases, the most recent ones, and how they managed to revert the trend. And after that, we decided to do a proper research and do it quantitatively, go through the last 125 years and identify all cases where this happened. And the key thing here is that those 2 things should be linked not only in timing, where autocratization is also reversed into and becomes democratization, but also should be linked endogenously, like qualitatively. So it should be a reaction towards the process of autocratization. And that was the idea that was driving the paper, is basically identify all such cases and looked where it happened. So we are talking, just to clarify from the very beginning, when we are talking as an autocratization, this means like any movement on democracy index from by becoming like less democratic. So it may also happen in an autocratic regime. It may happen in electoral autocracy that gradually becomes more and more authoritarian towards closed autocracy and then moves back so not democratized, but becomes back to electoral autocracy. And then a subset of those are the ones that start in democracies. And most of those cases historically happened during the last 30 years, which is, again, very typical for the third wave of autocratization, as Stefan identified in his research as well.
Very, did you say typical? I couldn't quite catch up.
It's typical that the third wave of autocratization affects a lot more democracies than before. This what I mean. So it's kind of the trend for the third wave of autocratization was this is something new. The third wave affected a lot more democracies than previous two waves. So it's also not surprising that like the reversal happens mostly in countries that used to be democratic.
Stefan, could you just quickly backtrack to the three waves that were just described there? Describe these three
sure.
waves. Yeah.
Yeah, we usually talk about three waves of democratization and now three waves of autocratization. And the first wave of democratization was that beginning in the 1800s till around 1920, with gradually more democracies in the world, mostly parts of Europe democratizing. And then we had a reverse wave in the 1930s leading into World War II. That was a lot of democracies fell victim to Nazism and fascism,
Right.
often being invaded by Nazi Germany, obviously. And then we had a wave of democratization that got off in the 50s and into the 60s. That was a lot of newly independent countries that became democracies or democratized to some extent. But then a reverse wave again in the 60s into the 70s with the establishment of a lot of military regimes and one-party states. And then with the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974, setting off the third wave of democratization, spreading through first Southern Europe, then Latin America in the 1980s, and also parts of East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on. And then with the big bang of end of the Cold War in 89 and the spreading to the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Africa, and other parts of Asia. And then somewhere there in the late 1990s, early 2000s, a reverse wave started that we didn't really figure out until maybe 10, 15 years later, of a wave of autocratization. And just to emphasize what the numbers you showed earlier from the Democracy Report and Marina talked about, this wave is stronger than ever before. Like the first and second wave of autocratization was nothing in comparison. This is worse than in the 1930s moving into the World War II. The number of countries, 42 at the same time moving back on democracy, is higher than ever before. The share of number of countries in the world is also higher than before. The share of the world population living in countries moving back on democracy is greater than ever before, right? It's unprecedented, the strength of this wave of autocratization. And that's sort of the bad news, right? And then this paper with the U-turns is the good news, right? That even if, so it's very rare that if autocratization starts in a democracy, like in the US, now I would say it's starting again, it's very rare for it to survive as a democracy. Autocratization typically goes on then until democracy breaks down, disappears, as in Erdogan's Turkey or Putin's Russia and so on. But the U-turn then are much more frequent also among those that started in democracies than we knew before. So all hope is not lost, so to speak, right? even if the process leads to the dismantling of democracy. If you can turn it around quickly, then that is a good possibility.
And is there a sense of what factors in society or can result in that? This is a key question, of course. And there's actually a question came in. Kyle Lawler Bagkal over on LinkedIn says, "Is there any sense of what types of resistance are critical for the U-turn to happen?" You describe swiftness, like it has to happen quickly, but maybe you could all talk about that a little bit, Marina and Stefan and Fabio.
Yeah, if I can go.
Yeah.
I think that in terms of the resistance, um, we jumped into each of every of the 102 cases of U-turns that we discovered, and trying to figure out exactly this question. And in terms of the in the last 30 years, the most by far the most important of all reasons for U-turns to take place is democratic resilience. It is opposition parties, opposition elites to come together and to jointly unite forces in towards more democratic principles. And this is before you were talking about Brazil. This is exactly what happened in Brazil with Lula. Lula did not win the elections alone. He won election thanks to a extremely broad coalition of opposition parties, a civil society organization, and citizens going to the polls and voting and using their voting rights to vote at least against Bolsonaro in the case of Brazil. So we see that these three elements of unifying factors of parties, elites, the democratic elites, civil society organization, and the involvement also of protests. Let's see, for example, what happened 2 months ago in South Korea.
Right.
People just took the street and just protested against the martial law being in place by the president of South Korea. That is exactly what we're talking about.
So good old-fashioned street work is part of it.
It is part of it.
Do there have to be certain functionalities in institutions that can then revive? Like in the United States, I think about this question of the aggrandizement of the executive pressing against the courts and the other and Congress. Do you have to have capacity there for the street efforts to make a difference? Maybe Marina
Yeah, and what we see is that there is usually this in democratic reaction, there is usually a combination of factors. On the one hand, there are institutional factors. These are courts, independent judiciary that stand up and do not allow executive aggrandizement. And this is why independence of the judiciary is often the key element among those that contribute to democratic reaction. Then we also know that elections play a critical role. And those are magic moments in time around which you can unite opposition and coalition, build a coalition against wannabe dictator and vote against him. Also, some other critical events, such as end of term limit, for example, when an executive tries to extend a term limit, and people go against it, either in a referendum or just go in protest on the street. Then there are also a coalition of actors. This is what Fabio was talking about, united opposition. And this is very important to have a united opposition, not fragmented opposition, because fragmented opposition usually plays into the autocrat hands. So they help them survive. So then protests, again, they do not solve all the problems. We saw protests in Hong Kong that didn't solve the situation, but united, and we are talking about mass protests. So protests like in South Korea, where millions of people go to the street at the same time. And then to some extent also international democratic support that plays a role in certain cases. Not always, but it can help when there are actors on the ground that fight against the executive aggrandizement. And then one more thing, and this is something that we see quantitatively also, that it has to happen in a relatively short period of time. So typically within one electoral cycle, sometimes occasionally during the second electoral cycle. But what we also see that if autocratization lasts for more than a decade, then chances are almost lost. So this is a decade is a period when it is enough for an autocrat to establish more or less stable autocracy. So in these scenarios, we do not expect, unfortunately, we do not expect a process in Hungary, for example, to be reversed because it has been going on for way too long. So at this time, this is enough for an autocrat to establish something more or less stable.
That's so interesting. So
Let me just
yeah.
sort of tie this back a bit to United States and what's happening right now, right? So some of these factors that Fabio and Marina talked about, unified coalition of political parties against the autocratizing incumbent. Well, the United States only has one other political party, and it's in a minority. That makes it very difficult. And then the judiciary standing up has been critical in many cases. And right now, what's happening in the U.S., of course, is that Trump, Vance, and Musk are questioning the legitimacy of the court to restrain their power, right? Musk talking about a corrupt judge. He needs to be impeached when he rules against Musk. J.D. Vance talking about that judges are not allowed to control executives' legitimate power. So they know that the judiciary can stand in their way and trying to undermine it. And one thing that wasn't mentioned, but should also be mentioned, is that clear pattern of countries autocratizing, the spread of disinformation by the government and its allies goes up. That's a very universal pattern across the 31 million data on democracy we have. Whereas in democratizing countries, the spread of disinformation goes down. This is also what happened in Brazil. Their work to stop and reduce the spread of disinformation around the elections was critical. And you know what's happening in the U.S. right now, right?
Yeah.
It's so. I think all these factors that we've talked about that are important are directly relevant to the ongoing process in the U.S.
Boy, so yeah, that the U.S. has these very deep paradoxes in terms of some of the fundamental institutions, like the First Amendment, can cut against progress when systems are sort of overtaken by forces with power. That's really a troubling part of this dynamic. There's a couple of questions that have come in. Some are already related to some things you've addressed. Here's Ivan Alzupo on Facebook says, wouldn't modern weaponization with the military and control of information, this is your point, make a reversal of autocracy by citizens more difficult in developed countries, especially thinking of the U.S. right now? That's actually, you addressed her question. I will broaden this out a little bit. I was looking at the statistics for Africa, for example, and again, the level of democratization seems very low. How much we're all in developed countries, but what's the concern when you think about developing parts of the world where so much of the population growth is happening and potential advancement from deep poverty and the like? What's the deal when you think about sub-Saharan Africa and places like that with these dynamics? Maybe Fabio?
I think that Stefan is the expert in
Okay.
sub-Saharan Africa here. But like in general, one thing that I want to say is, building on what Marina and Stefan said already, tools of autocratization are spread across the world in a very worrying pattern. Actually, if my memory is correct, we see that democratization in sub-Saharan Africa is slightly more than autocratization, for example. So we see that the usage of disinformation, also the attempts by the government to censor so going after any form of opposition, as Stefan was mentioning, is of course the first threat that happens once an anti-democratic incumbent takes office. So that's also why the case of the United States is not that unique. What we see unfolding day by day in the last 2-3 weeks, it's an unfortunate news, but it's not really breaking news.
Stefan, do you want to talk a little bit about Africa?
I could talk a lot about Africa, but let me just note a couple of things. It's like, on the one hand, yeah, the level of democracy has been fairly low in sub-Saharan Africa, but also even worse in North Africa. Despite the sort of the democratization that went on in the 90s, a lot of countries did not really become democracies, although they moved toward it. What we have seen happening in sub-Saharan Africa over the last couple of years is an increasing number of military coups, and but also other forms of autocratization. But it's sort of that the coups, returning of the coups, has sort of indicated that the international norm around multi-party elections and that we strive towards democracy and all that is weakening, right? So that these militaries feel like, okay, now we can take over and there will be no consequences. With Trump in office, I guess there won't be any consequences. And more so, sub-Saharan Africa will now be really affected by the closing down of USAID and all associated programs, right? In 120 countries around the world, the both USAID and State Department, and then that architecture with National Endowment for Democracy, IRI, NDI, IFES, their programs have been really important in sort of supporting democracy and then defending against autocratization. Now all that disappears. Right. And it also sends a signal to any wannabe dictator out there that US is not going to do anything. Maybe to the contrary, get a clap on the shoulder. We see that happening also in Europe. Like Orban in Hungary has already gone out and say, yeah, now we'll close down all these organizations that had American support, because they're not only foreign agents, they're illegal. Musk and Trump are saying that USAID programs were corrupt and seeking to overthrow governments. So yeah, now we're going to close them down. So he's going to increase the repression of civil society in Hungary as a consequence of this. So wow. There are many repercussions here.
Oh boy. Well, the U-turn potential in the U.S. Has the congressional midterm elections would probably be one of the factors that can at least put a bit of a break on things. I don't know if that feels too hopeful, or is that part of the dynamic in the U.S. that can make a difference? Maybe Marina? Sorry, Fabio.
Yeah, one thing is that, as we were mentioning before, the first term of Trump already saw an autocratization of the country, which did not result in a U-turn with Biden. So we have kind of a very recent example that, despite it being possible, not even with the midterm, but like with the presidential election, he was able to, with Biden, was able to stop the autocratization, which is not equal to, say, reverting to a U-turn.
Yeah.
So I think that the first very important challenge for the US, as I think that here we all agree that the United States is going towards a new episode of autocratization, is to stop the autocratization wave, and then right after that, re-emerging with a U-turn. These are two interlinked processes, but they're not. They are consequential, but they're not necessarily happening at the same time. As we see, for example, the struggles that is happening in Poland, where they were able to stop the autocratization, but they were not able, at least yet, to revert it into a U-turn.
That's so interesting. Well, I guess there's a lot of work to be done, both in monitoring these patterns and trying to energize the capacities to have enduring reversals. There is the U.S. is, I've written about this before, and again in the context of climate policy, energy policy, you end up with whiplash if you're just focusing on presidential change. Executive orders are not a way to have enduring change, and that's why you end up with this kind of flip flop that we're seeing now with Trump after Biden, and after Trump after Biden. There's one more question here that we might fit in, and I really appreciate your time in deconstructing your work, and we'll have to check in periodically. Joe Hopfeld on YouTube says, "Where does this U.S. Supreme Court's Citizens United fit here? Once corporations and concentrations of wealth become immortal superhumans, voting essentially ceased to matter here. Corporations are human beings now, and is that part of that aggrandizement that's happened that isn't sort of specifically the executive, but has led to outsized power for certain parts of society?" Marina, maybe any thoughts? This relates to
Uh,
the economic policy.
yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say here is the way Trump came to power, at least initially in 2016, it was mostly he was a symptom of what was happening in the US. So on the one hand, there was rising inequality, and that was related to globalization to a certain extent. So kind of blue collars workers became uh, less wealthy, so less wealth off, while at the same time those that were well educated, they were increasing their wealth, and this inequality was rising. And then the second thing that we saw was concentration of power. And the multiplying number of multi-billionaires exercising ever greater influence over politics. And the way kind of Trump came to power, he was a symptom of what this rising polarization, rising inequality that was happening in the US. But the moment that he came to power, he became the cause of autocratization himself. So he started to dismantle um, all democratic institutions and norms. And we know that usually that happens with patterns. So it happens first, the attacks usually start with attacks on the media and civil society, and then it goes on to attacks on the courts. And he started to replace people and influence the ones who go to the Supreme Court. And then eventually it affects the elections as well. So the thing, what I'm afraid of is that unless we are able to solve this polarization that is happening in the US right now, this polarization between the citizens, this rising inequality, these disagreements. So it would be very difficult to address what's happening with autocratization. So you need to go back to the root cause. What was causing? How did it happen that Trump ended being a president of the United States? So I think this.
And I do see this piece this was sort of a warning before the election in a publication, Populism Studies, and here we are. I guess part of your conclusion here, and audiences can take away, is these are serious, deep concerns. The U.S. has felt insulated from some of these patterns, and Stefan, as you were saying earlier, younger people haven't even seen those previous waves of autocratization, and the idea that we could really descend or reverse things seems even more reinforced than when this piece ran before the election. what's your final call to people? You know, what should the average person, citizen who wants a functioning country, whatever their politics might be, should do or think, and in the days and weeks ahead?
Well, maybe one thought is that in addition to what we already talked about, what's been very important in many instances of U-turns, but also in instances of democratization earlier, is popular mobilization. A lot of people out in the streets, a lot of people in the U.S. context call your congressman, right, or congresswoman. Put use the power of mobilization uh, in your interest for your rights and democratic rights and protecting them.
And don't take it for granted, and don't think someone else is going to do it for you.
No.
Boy, well, there's a significant number of people watching. So maybe if Fabio and Marina have your final sort of call to action here, or this report, your paper, and the work of VDEM more generally are really invaluable. So, what would be a last statement just to make that people can take away from this webcast? Marina and then Fabio.
Well, I think the good news is that we see that the number of democracies that survive autocratization is increasing historically. So that means that democratic resilience is unprecedented in historical terms. And then the other good news is that the US democracy is not that easy to be dismantled. So it's not something that can happen overnight. So it's a relatively stable, and the potential for resilience is very, very high. So the danger is there, but the potential to revert the trend is also very high. And then, as Staffan has already said, that mass mobilization and coordination of actions, and then critical events as elections. So that would be the next checkpoint for the US democracy, what happens in 2 years from now with the elections. But last time Trump was in power, the U.S. democracy survived. It didn't become a U-turn, but the U.S. democracy survived. The process was stopped. And then, just to give some numbers, we looked at that in terms of the level of democracy that was by the end of the last Trump's presidency. And by the end of the last time presidency, it was back almost to the level of the level of democracy that the U.S. had during the Watergate scandal. So just to explain, so the way it has declined. So you may track it back up to 90s, 70s, something. So it's approximately the same level, if you see. But it was, as you see on the graph, during Biden's presidency, there was something that was resembling a U, but it didn't become a U. So that it was restored to some extent, but it was not restored to the level that was that the US had before Trump came to power. And then right now it is even below the average for the Western democracies. So
there you go. Fabio, any last thoughts? And the one thing I wanted to ask also was about the press, the media here in the United States, both through the Trump first administration and now journalists, particularly major media, have been appropriately criticized for taking a normal approach to conveying what's going on, sort of a piece by piece approach, and not really getting at these fundamental risk factors. Is there something the press needs to do to get this to be part of the picture without being, activist, or do they need to be activists?
Well, just to connect with also what's been said already, I think that the key to resist is political participation by all means, by all kinds of professions as well, journalists included. I think that one aspect that we haven't touched probably, um, uh, but it should be said as well, is this kind of memory of always. Before we were joking that well, we haven't seen the third wave of democratization properly. Well, being in a stable democracy and not having that kind of memory is kind of a blessing, but it also comes with a cost that one has to uphold democratic principles and kind of invest in that kind of political participation. Without participation, it's from citizens. The democracy, of course, will be eroded, leaving the hand to anti-democratic leaders attacking aspects like freedom of speech in general,
Right.
or any other kinds of freedom that we have.
And there's one last thing before we close out. It looked like in up until December you were looking for country experts for VDEM. You closed the applications, but are there still areas around the world where you'd like better data? One of the things I've dealt with climate is what's called street light science. It's like looking for your keys under the lights and we have these big gaps in data. Is this still a big need, having better data around the world?
We have fairly good coverage. We've worked with um, over 4,300 scholars and other experts from over 180 countries. And for most countries, we've had about 15, 25 experts, scholars, typically studying civil society in Ecuador or political parties in Zambia, um,
Great.
to help gather the raw data for these assessments. I mean, from some microstates, it's harder to find experts. I mean, there are not that many experts on the judicial system of the Solomon Islands, for example.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yes, it varies a little bit, but it's mostly sort of microstates where it's harder to find the requisite
Okay.
expertise.
Well, I really appreciate your time. Thank you. And if there's follow-up questions from viewers, as this ends up archived, people can watch it later. I'll send them to you all. And it's been great to have you on Sustain What? Sustainability to me includes sustainable functional society and the systems that make society function. So uh, I can't only focus on wildfire and climate and the like. And it's really good to understand the waves of autocratization, waves of democratization around the world, and what we can do as individuals and uh, groups, the media, and the rest to make the world a better place bit by bit. So thanks to Marina, Stefan, and Fabio for joining today from VDEM Institute. And that's a wrap for Sustain What for today. And I'd love to stay in touch with all of you.